Did you know that males are 4 times more likely than females to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder? And females are typically diagnosed later than males. My, I wasn't diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder until I was in my 20s. I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was a teenager, and I had some misdiagnoses before I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. I received speech therapy, physical therapy, and occupational therapy when I was in kindergarten through 2nd grade, and some of those I received later on. Due to my IEP, or individualized education plan, I was able to get accommodations like testing in a quiet setting and extra time on tests, and that really helped me with school. Unfortunately, I wasn't diagnosed until I was older, and I started suspecting it when I was already married and I already had my ADHD diagnosis, but my therapist at the time started telling me all these things that I was doing wrong, like not making eye contact, not understanding emotions. She pointed out that I wouldn't know more complex emotion names. I pretty much would just say happy, angry, sad, and I wouldn't be able to identify my emotions that well. That was one thing that was pointed out. She also would talk about, like, she actually had me practice little tricks for faking eye contact and body language advice that she would give me. I remember, like, one time she crossed her arms and she said, "Sorry, I'm not angry, I'm cold." And I remember thinking, what? That's the sign of being angry? And I was adult and I literally did not have an idea that that would be angry, like crossing arms. I also didn't understand why the eye contact was important. And I also didn't understand stuff like people would perceive me as being cool, and friends would kind of complain that I would just say hi and not, act happy to see them, but it was more because I was just thinking about what I would have to do when I was out and about, and I just didn't understand it. And I was also way too literal. And I'll discuss this more in a different video, but the same therapist discovered that I was way too literal, which for certain things. She pointed out that the irritability I had was actually normal to an extent. And that was one of the reasons why I had been misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder. The thing is that we didn't understand that I was reacting to things. I did eventually bring up to, like, that same therapist that I wondered if I had autism, and she was very extremely dismissive at the time. Her main concern was that she did not think there was anything I could do about it. She didn't see why it would be helpful. And also at the time, that was with the older DSM, where they didn't allow for somebody to have ADHD and an autism diagnosis. And my ADHD medication clearly helps my ADHD. Like, I'm very hyper and irritable, and I very clearly have ADHD. Okay, so anyways, there was a game that I used to play. I won't name it because it was not a very good game, but I was obsessed with it. And I started playing it 24/7. Or practically 24/7. It was bad. Like, it was on my phone and I would play it everywhere, and it was causing social issues. And because of that, I ended up seeking out a different therapist that would help me with the video game compulsion. And that was, like, one of the things that my new therapist noticed, was that I was very obsessed. I was talking about the game a lot. And she also noticed, because I don't do this that much anymore, but I used to touch my face all the time, like my glasses. And she started noticing I touched my face a lot. And I would also talk about things like, I would be surprised when I was in college that people expected me to know their names, because I never would bother to know everybody's names. And I didn't understand how people knew my name. And I also I just didn't change facial expressions that much. I used to speak more monotone. And because I didn't change facial expressions, that's why I would get like misdiagnosed with depression, unfortunately. It was all over my records. I also was extremely literal. I did get some sarcasm, but not always. And sometimes I wouldn't get jokes. I don't know if I ever quite got the humor, but there is a joke where my husband's family would say they were in a car wreck, but they didn't mean it. But I kind of took it too far, and I like fake cried and acted very upset. And sorry, it's awful, but I just did not understand that that was too much. And I think that was a social nuance I did not get. I also didn't understand follow-up questions. I did not ask them. And I did not talk about my interests. I didn't ask people about their interests. I would talk about some stuff, but I went, it never occurred to me to just be like, hey, I like doing this for fun. What do you do for fun? Or, oh, I also aren't the best. I'm not the best at like recognizing or remembering faces. And that was actually something my therapist said. She used that sign and the fact that I didn't bother to know people's names, that I was repeatedly touching my face at the time, and that I had interests I would obsessively talk about, like the game. She started to suspect that I have autism spectrum disorder, and she didn't really see any evidence for bipolar disorder. And I'm not trying to say bipolar is bad. There are people that legitimately have it, but we just started to realize that there was a chance that I was misdiagnosed. So my therapist suggested I take a few tests online, and I brought those scores to my psychiatrist, and that got him thinking, and I actually got him and my primary doctor to refer me to a psychologist for a evaluation for autism to see if I met the criteria. So I had at least 3 appointments. One was a follow-up appointment. On the first appointment, I brought in records. I brought in several records, and I just sort of started naming a lot of the stuff that I had been struggling with. And the doctor listened. So he scheduled testing, and he had my husband fill out a questionnaire, and I think one of my parents had to fill out something as well. I believe the fact that I had school records, and I know not everybody has school records, but in my case, I found records that would say stuff about what I did. Like, it would talk about how I did not do well with change. I didn't have good social skills. It talked about how I wouldn't know how to react to kids. I would just make faces if they complimented me. That I was very uncoordinated. I just didn't get along with kids. Like, even in 4th grade, kids would actually ask not to sit by me, and I had my own desk away from the other kids. Just stuff like that. I had definitely had a lot of social problems, and even though I was able to get some friends in high school, it was always people that also had accommodations, which is okay, but or behavioral problems, or just people that also I found out may not have had the best social skills. Oh, one thing is my husband tends to be a little bit literal, so that was something that could have possibly affected the results for the questionnaire. But because I had brought in the school records and I had talked like so much about my problems, and the doctor was able to observe me, because one thing that I really had to advocate for was that I had not avoided social interaction. I may have had some times where I didn't have as much interaction as people because I had a atypical high school education where part of the time, due to medical issues, a teacher would come to my home. But I did actually engage in outside activities. I was in dance for many years with other kids, and I was very active at church, and I did do things with like the couple of friends I had at a fairly regular basis. Like I would watch movies. I would go to the theater like multiple times in a weekend with one of my friends. I was also in a women's church group later on as an adult, and I did engage with activities. The reason why this is important is social anxiety can look a lot like autism, and the doctor's theory was maybe I just wasn't around people enough. But that's why I brought the school records that talked about how I was not able to pick up on social cues, and the school had tried to get me to learn social skills, but the thing is, I didn't know to mimic others. It just wasn't something I naturally did, and I tend to be someone that needs stuff directly taught, which I found out much later. So I'm skipping around, but I am I'm in ABA, applied behavioral analysis, for at least the past year, and that's something that I've learned is that I really, really benefit from being taught social skills, or being taught things explicitly. I didn't get ABA until a few years after my diagnosis, but at the time of my autism diagnosis, the doctor did say to join a social skill group to learn social skills, but we couldn't find a group that my insurance covered at the time. Back to the testing, he did cognitive testing, he did ADHD testing, I think it was a con or something with a computer for ADHD. He did different psychiatric screening, and also having questionnaires in the Violin for adaptive behavior. Often adaptive behavior is lower with people with autism. It is with me. So that was a sign that he looked for. He was also observing me, and he reviewed my school records. And I also talked to him. I reached out to some people that used to know me on Facebook, and one thing that I kept finding was they would say, I'm shy and quiet, I'm reserved, but I was nice, but they would just say I was very quiet. So that's important, because I never got it. I never understood that how I was being perceived. Because again, it kind of goes back to where I would just be like, hi, quietly. It wasn't so much that I don't believe it was so much that I was self-conscious, because I was able to do things like fine arts and stuff, and perform or be in front of people, but I just didn't understand that someone who wants to be social talks a lot or asks questions. I think and then later on, once I found out that I should be nodding, because that was something my previous therapist had told me, was to nod or show signs that I'm listening, I would just spend way too much time nodding. And I still do that to an extent, instead of focusing, because of monotropism. So I was diagnosed with, it was actually pervasive developmental disorder, but later on my psychiatrist took it to autism spectrum disorder, because this was the year that I was able to be diagnosed with both ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, due to the DSM-5, which is basically a diagnostic manual that psychiatrists go by, or mental health care professionals go by. So due to that, I was able to get both diagnoses, because they're no longer contradicted, but I still had my parents and other family members fill out questionnaires that I showed my psychiatrist, because he just wanted to be really sure. And I did get the diagnosis, and I actually have been evaluated for autism spectrum disorder formally at least 3 different times. 5 if you count when I had to get ABA, and also when I went to vocational rehabilitation services. They also did a mini exam with a psychologist. But the interesting thing is the questionnaire that I was given before, the very first one, or at least my husband was given, it doesn't really properly show like the signs of autism, or it doesn't really label the severity as well. I did look into it later. My husband later got some help with a more recent questionnaire, and it definitely showed more of my symptoms. Anyway, some things I definitely recommend, even if you don't have school record, just trying to like bring examples or information from other people. I get that it would be ideal for a doctor to take your word for it, but the thing is they tend not to. It's just something I noticed. Be prepared to have someone out to be able to say, like, so-and-so said that I do this or I do that, or hey, I pace a lot, or I get really overwhelmed when there's a lot of sound. It just, be prepared to advocate for yourself, especially if you're female. I still have like that one doctor that puts history of autism. But no, I have autism and I'm autistic, but sometimes it's just difficult. Like a long time ago, they used to think only males could be autistic, and then only females that had it more noticeable, and often with like intellectual disability as well, were the ones that were getting diagnosed more. I know we've come a long ways, but sometimes just being married, or even they'll say, "How are you?" back, like asking back, "How are you?" can just make a doctor think you don't have it. A lot of us have learned by the time we're adults that there are proper responses to questions like, "How are you?" I was taught like fine or good. That's my diagnosis story. I'm hoping to get into my misdiagnosis and ABA and just other stuff that I want to talk about. Thanks for watching. Bye. Larissa out.